Okay, today's guest is Preston Dennett, who began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and coworkers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He's a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 30 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. So let's welcome today's guest, Preston Dennett. Welcome, Preston.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for
Yeah.
inviting me.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a delay getting on in terms of accessing the information, but I'm glad to have you here. I've been very interested in the subject of UFOs, having had my own encounters with either through dreams and through real life experiences. And I know you do some of the work and have your YouTube channel and which I watch, which is very interesting. And you speak about a lot of the different encounters that people have. But before you did any of this work, how did you get involved in the UFO research to begin with?
It wasn't voluntary, I can tell you that. It's not something I was looking for or even believed in. I was actually really skeptical, very much a materialist, I guess you'd say, very scientifically minded. Show me, I'll believe it. Otherwise, it's not real. Of course, that did all change. And I'm thankful I was pretty young, actually. I was 21 years old, 1986. And I heard a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska, just a simple sighting by a Japanese commercial airliner crew. Turned out to be a real classic case in terms of the field of UFOs, with a lot of witnesses and radar returns and that sort of thing. But of course, the news report was very tongue-in-cheek, very joking, very brief. But they did show the picture of the pilot. I thought, wow, this poor deluded guy saw a reflection off the ice cap. I mean, I was coming up with any stupid explanation to explain this away. But it turned out my brother Mark had seen a UFO some years earlier. I remember he came running to the house and tried to tell everyone, and really none of us were interested. I come from a pretty big family, 6 kids. And he's the only one who ever claimed anything like this. So when he said that, I'm like, I don't think so, Mark. But hearing this report in the news interested me enough to ask him about it. And he described this incredible sighting of a metallic disc with colored lights on it, a dome on top, treetop level, totally silent. I mean, he actually chased it down Reseda Boulevard in Southern California with his 2 friends. So he's describing all this, and it's really impressing me because this is, a man I love and trust. I know he's not going to lie to me. It's clear he's not misperceiving or hallucinating. There was really no go-to to explain this away. And I'm just staring at him. He's like, listen, Preston, if you don't believe me, you can ask Phil and Greg. Those were his friends,
Right. Wow.
who I knew. So I did, of course. And they confirmed his story. That's what opened the door for me. And I found out that his, future wife, his girlfriend, had encounters with little blue beings as a young girl. And found out my other brother's girlfriend, soon to be wife, had seen UFOs as well. She had witnesses.
Yeah.
She later, that year after seeing a UFO, a couple of months later, had a face-to-face encounter with what we now know are gray ETs. But
Yeah.
when she told me this, she's like, I saw something else strange. I'm like, okay, what? She started describing grays. She'd never heard of grays. She didn't even think these were ETs, really. She just knew they weren't human.
Right.
But as she's going, from head to toe, she's an artist with a great eye for detail and a pretty much eidetic memory. She was describing grays down to in detail. Because by this time I'm buying books, right? I'm trying to disprove this and finding out that this is a real subject. I mean, there's validity to the phenomenon. It's been studied for decades. There's a cover-up.
Yeah.
Serious people are looking into this. So yeah, it hit home for me literally. I mean, I had friends who had encounters. I brought it up at work. Several people there had encounters, including, missing time. Being one lady's daughter was taken on board. I knew her daughter pretty well.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting.
So not good news for me. I mean, it took a year of adjusting really
Yeah,
to it. And yeah, I bought all the books, started joining all the groups like MUFON, attending conventions, eventually started writing articles and did research for 10 years, basically, writing articles before I put out my first book. So that's kind of how it all started for me.
yeah, it's interesting because you look at the rabbit hole of information that exists, and what makes someone actually go up the path and try to investigate and to look into this phenomena, or some cases reality, and like you see people who question, who come from more of a scientific basis. I guess they say the more resistance, the more eventually that what you resist will come back to you and open you up to something. Uh, what do you think the reason is that people, first of all, are encountered with these types of ships and beings? Uh, is there a specific reason that they're made to be aware of this as opposed to other people? Is it the amount of being closed off that people have, or is it that people are being who are supposed to see it will see it?
Well, a difficult question to answer because it's somewhat speculative.
Right.
But, having been involved with research for decades now, I think most people at some point are given the opportunity to experience something like this. Uh, I mean, not everyone sees a UFO, so there is sort of a random element to it, certainly. Because if you look at, statistically speaking, if you analyze the reports, a lot of kids see UFOs because they're outside, they're playing, they're under an open sky.
That's right.
And we see people whose professions put them outside. And often, there's a lot more people who see UFOs who are police officers or night watchmen or truckers or people driving along a highway at night, which, may seem obvious, but it's an important detail.
Right.
You have to be outside if you want to see something that's outside.
Yeah.
So there's that element.
Yeah, which
Does
is
follow families.
yeah, it does follow families. Yeah, I've interviewed people who've said to me, for example, I think it was in the Hathaway region of Massachusetts, if I have it correctly or not, that certain family members kept seeing it, and other people who I've interviewed, Dr. Irina Scott, she was telling me about her family history of people then one person revealed and other people sharing. Uh, the question is, as you just mentioned before, I just wanted to touch upon it. You said when people are outside, I think you had mentioned once before that maybe July is the most prominent time where people have sightings in the summertime. And I could attest to that for myself, I guess, maybe because it is being outdoors by the beach, which is where I was, as opposed to being indoors, right? You wouldn't be able to see it, looking out the window every minute of the day. But I was outdoors at about 1 o'clock on the beaches of New Jersey, and I happened to have seen a disc that was hovering about 400 feet in the sky. It looked like a drone initially, almost shapeshifted from a flat disc to something else, and then just took off on a 45-degree angle.
Wow.
So yeah, so for me, when I heard that you said July, it's actually when I had seen my first sighting was in July as well.
Interesting. Yeah, the summer months do spike significantly, which you would expect
Right.
because they are warmer and people are outside. It's the vacation months. But yeah, July 4th, interestingly enough, is the most common day to see a UFO. I thought a lot of people are seeing fireworks. Was really what I thought until I started really looking into the reports because it turns out, you can call down UFOs to a certain extent, and fireworks seem to be a factor here because there are so many. I ended up writing a whole chapter in one of my books about this
Right, right.
because it seemed like such an odd thing. But there are many cases where UFOs are attracted to certain areas. Whether it's nuclear power plants or anything technological. This is
Maybe
another thing. People around airports or army bases or nuclear power stations or, hydroelectric dams. You're much more likely to see a UFO in those areas. I mean,
right.
researchers Jim and Coral Lorenzen predicted this pattern when they said, well, there's a new factory being built over here. Bet you there's going to be sightings. And there were. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. And so, for example, White Sands, where we do a lot of rocketry and nuclear research, a UFO magnet. Edwards Air Force Base as well.
Right.
Just case after case after case after case. UFOs are seen often over graveyards, oddly enough, over mines. There's certain areas. But I have looked into this extensively. It's evenly divided between men and women. There's really no basis on age or ancestry or religion or anything like that. There are
Yeah.
geographical areas which do seem to be particularly conducive,
Right.
or sort of flap areas or wave areas. But yeah, it definitely does track families in terms of really extensive encounters with people having direct contact with ETs, UFOs, the ETs, and I do think that's what we're dealing with here.
Yes. Yes.
Do seem to be attracted to people who are profoundly psychic or have psychic ability of some kind.
Yeah.
So that's another pattern for sure, because contactees in general experience quite a bit of what we would call paranormal.
Yeah.
But I did find another pattern, which I found super interesting, and I keep seeing it. You may have heard of the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Yes.
I mean, everyone. They were social workers, very active in their community to help people. And, I kept getting cases involving social workers. It's just sort of like, okay, what's your job? This became a question to ask. And I found a lot of people who have contact are people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. I mean, it's definitely a pattern because we have so many nurses and doctors and social workers and environmentalists, human rights activists, teachers, inventors, police officers, musicians, artists, healers of any kind.
Yes. Yes.
This really, people have gotten this information directly from the ETs, asking them, they basically are saying, yes, we're helping those who help others. So that's another pattern. Who is being contacted and why?
Right. Right. Right.
Not entirely random as it might seem.
Yeah. That's my feeling because, in communicating, doing interviews with people, and having people speak about their near-death experiences and their contact in this realm of meeting galactic beings who are there to assist them and heal them, and receiving information from them in that near-death experience, as well as healings even in the evening when they're sleeping or in person, or other types of encounters. I interviewed a person who had two women, for example, who had immaculate conceptions through their ET experience. One of them didn't want to share it, obviously, on video. She was a flight attendant, but spoke about it. And then another person spoke about it openly from Norway, where she saw the hands operating above her stomach. And then within days, or maybe a week or so, she had morning sickness and went to the doctor. And the doctor said, "You're pregnant." And she said, "But I haven't been intimate with anyone. How's this possible?" But then after having had heard from other family members their contact, that they've had, and she saw these hands near her abdomen, then she felt that she was part of somewhat of a hybridization program of being used for I guess ET conception or whatever was taking place. Uh, but the
I
interesting,
have cases of that too.
yeah,
No,
interesting,
no doubt.
interesting.
Yeah.
To be a little bit off the cuff in terms of speaking to, I do shamanic work and I do Akashic record readings, but I've spoken to shamans who are in their late 70s who've been on UFOs and have been taken to different places underground, and also spoke about, seeing Jesus through an alien or through a mothership. And other people who've had near-death experiences say they saw this mothership where Jesus came off of in their NDE. So all interesting stuff that you're bringing light to, and the fact that you repetitively tell stories that are so consistent with many of the things that other people share, uh, creates almost such a vast level of inspiration for it. Um, could you share a little bit of a story? I mean, the Betty and Barney Hill story is very interesting, which many people know about. But could you share like a profound story that you do so many different stories on your podcast where you talk about like a profound thing where a person was driving? Is there one thing that stands out that's interesting to you personally? Or I know there are many.
Yeah, I mean, I
I know
don't
it's
think
so vast.
the general public has no idea
I
really
know.
whatsoever how many people have these experiences. It's not thousands, it's not tens of thousands, it's in the millions. And almost nobody is talking about it, particularly if they're taken on board. 1%, maybe 5%. So any real estimates of how common this is are vastly underestimated. And it's difficult to choose between all these cases because there's so many.
Yeah.
But certainly one that caught my attention was a lady I interviewed by the name of Dolly Saffron, who her case was different from a lot of people because I interview a lot of people, and many of them have a lot of fear surrounding their experiences. And some, have to use hypnosis to recall what happened because there's missing time, which is, I think, partly a product of fear, their fear reaction to this. And Dolly Saffron contacted me. It's interesting. It turns out that, she does have fully conscious contact. Her case is really the most extensive I've ever researched. And she was looking to come forward and couldn't find a good researcher and told her ET contacts, so I'm having a real hard time with this. And they said, well, here's a guy we want you to look into, and gave her my name, which is crazy. I mean, when I heard that,
Wow.
I'm like, wow. But it wasn't the first time this has happened. It turned out it wouldn't be the last. So I guess I mean, when it keeps happening. So yeah, her case I loved because, she had lots of contact as a very young girl, as is pretty much the rule. Contact starts, people are little kids, toddlers, even earlier, but most people don't remember.
Right.
And she recalls this all from, months old, literally, up through age 2, 3, 4, 5, up to age 14. She was still trying to connect the dots. Like, who are these people coming into my room? Where am I going at night? Are these dreams? Because they were taking her to another planet, teaching her. And she tried to explain this to people because she knew they weren't dreams. But on the other hand, how can you talk to people about this when no one is talking about it?
Right.
So finally, at age 14, she's in her room in the Florida Everglades in her home, and a UFO drops down in her backyard. Trees are swishing around. She's looking at it going, oh, here we go again. I'm not going to have missing time. I can't deal with this.
Right.
And looks up at it, and there's little portholes, and there's a gray looking out at her. She's like, oh no, okay, that's this. Here's one of these guys again. And she freaks out, as often happens. It's very scary in the beginning for people. She dove under her bed. The room fills with light, and she wakes up. It's morning. She's like, shoot, it's
Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
again. She's looking at her pajamas. They're not her pajamas. They're on inside out and backwards. She's like, well, I
Wow.
know it's real. I knew it was real. Here's proof. So she went down to the into the kitchen where her mom was, cooking breakfast. She's like, Mom, did you see anything last night? Now her mom hates the subject. She knows it's real, doesn't want to deal with it. This is not uncommon in families of contactees. Some people have a hard time with it.
Yeah.
Uh, so her mom turns around and says, no, I'm not going to talk about this. And the radio is playing. Of course, the radio comes on and says, well, there were UFOs in this area, Dayland Mall area. Two
Yeah.
police officers saw it, buzzed their cruiser. So Dolly's jumping up and down like, I told you, I told you. She's hysterical. And her dad walks in and sees what's going on because her mom's screaming again. And her dad says, oh, get out of the kitchen, go find a place to meditate. You need to figure out what's going on. Now, her dad was a contactee. It is generational. It was clear her dad knew what was going on, even more than Dolly at this point. So Dolly goes into another room and meditates and does remember. And not only remembered this onboard experience, which was super extensive and really interesting, but recalled everything going back to childhood and really beyond past lives. I mean, it was a huge enlightenment to the point where she had a migraine, she's throwing up. It's a big deal. But
Yeah. Yeah.
in a nutshell, she recalled being pulled up this sort of energy beam into the craft. There was a tall gray there, who she calls Mama. She recognized her from previous encounters. The ship itself is alive. This is something so many contactees have told me, but she really laid it out in black and white. Dolly did. because the ship starts talking. It's like, do you remember me? Well, communicating telepathically.
Right, right, right.
Um, and Dolly's like, yes, I do. And she's freaking out. She actually threw up again right there on the ship. They cleaned her up, calmed her down, gave her a tour of the craft, showed her quarters. Super interesting. Took her up to the control room, said, would you like to sit down in the pilot seat? We want to show you something. And she did. And they took her, get this, to Saturn. When I heard this, I'm like, wow, this is exactly what happened to this other guy I interviewed, Jay
Really?
Gardner.
Wow.
I sat him in the seat, let him pilot it, took him to see Saturn. I've heard this from a number of cases, actually. Usually they'll take you, they'll show you a star field and you can see the Earth below,
Right.
which they did for her, but it was, they ended up taking her to the moon, flying around it, counseling her, like, how can we work with you? Do you want to work with us? She's like, oh, sure do. I would love to learn how to fly the craft. And I said,
Right.
okay. So this began really a lifetime of contact. It's an incredibly complex,
Yeah, absolutely.
extensive story. So, I mean, we could talk for hours about it, but
Yeah.
in a nutshell, yeah, that's my favorite case. So much information.
Yeah, it's interesting when, like, I do Akashic record readings, and when I do the readings, sometimes people will ask questions of star seeds of where they originate from, and I'll hear the different groups of Syrians, or depending where they may be coming from, uh, Lemurians, and it's interesting. Colors do come through, and the connection between certain people's DNA of having a past in a specific galactic family, and now being put into this place, and living as a human being, but having these connections that come off and on, as you say, through the abduction process, and being connected. It's almost as if they don't want to lose a connection with the people who are here, who they have contact with as part of their own family seed or star seed. Um, what's interesting is, I think you spoke a little bit about UFOs or ETs and fertilizer, and there's a connection between the two. And I've seen some of your podcasts where you go into detail about that, but maybe you could share a little bit with the audience about that finding.
Yeah, this was something that I was always a little bit curious about because of course, the very famous Betty and Barney Hill case. There appeared to be a connection that was never fully explored, where they had a bag of fertilizer in the trunk of their
Yeah,
car during their encounter. And this seemed to interest some researchers who came to visit them and asked them flat out, would you happen to have any connection to the nitrates industry? Any fertilizer? And they're like, no, what are you talking about? You're crazy. And then they remembered, well, actually, we did. And it was sort of ended there because these researchers never said why they asked that question. But apparently they knew something, and that was never followed up on. So I thought, you know what, I've got a pretty good database here. There's all these recorded encounters. Let's see what I can find. Because I had immediately thought of another case, or gosh, I forget his name. I think it was in New York. At any rate, there was a case involving a gentleman, a farmer, who saw a UFO land in his field and walked right up to it. This is a legit case. The Air Force certainly was very interested in this gentleman. He was very well educated, was a military officer, spoke a couple of languages, and was running this farm and has this UFO land. And there were these human like ETs, and he had an hour-long conversation with them. And they were very much interested in, I mean, there's some that he never revealed. He's like, this is private. I'm not going to talk about it. They gave him a prediction that an astronaut would die, which did, in fact, actually happen. But they were interested in uh, agriculture and the fact that he was fertilizing his field. And he explained about it. And they asked for a bag of fertilizer. And he said, okay. And he went back to get it and brought it up to this area. They were gone. It's like, well, shoot, they're gone. So he put it down and it was gone the next day. So apparently they did scoop it up. I
wow,
started looking into other cases of this, and it's a loose connection because I didn't find as much as I would hope.
right,
But there were cases of these craft over fertilizer plants and areas where there was a lot of wash off from fertilizer. There would be a huge wave of sightings of them apparently studying the ground, because how many cases are there? I'm sure you know of UFOs landing and they pull out their little buckets and shovels and they're taking little soil samples and grass clippings and picking flowers and leaves from trees and picking up animals too, for that matter. They're
Yeah.
very interested in our genetics. So I think they're very much interested in studying what's going on in our food sources as well, which is, fits in with exactly the message that so many contactees are getting, which
Yeah.
is their extreme concern about how we treat the environment, how we treat our own bodies, each other. Uh,
Yeah.
we're very, very concerned about, us chopping down the forests and polluting the air and the water and destroying the environment in so many different ways.
Right. You hear about these stories about these alien groups that you've just mentioned, but then again, you hear about reptilian groups, the infiltration of going deeper beyond the surface of just the human population, but also the human population and the political forum itself. Uh, I had a shaman friend who I speak to, communicate. He's in his late 70s, who has a history of contact, as I mentioned before, and also speaks about how the influence of different reptilian groups have infiltrated or have always infiltrated specific forums or areas of our political situation. Um, Not to say that we need to get into that exactly, but what's your take on people's encounters with other beings other than grays and high-end galactic energies that are coming through to enhance people's lives? There are groups that are actually not as benevolent as perhaps meets the eye.
Well, I'm not going to deny that there aren't bad ETs out there, because look at us. Here on
Right,
Earth,
right.
we're just saturated with negativity, and there's definitely negative elements here on this planet. People who don't have our best interests in mind, and we're all extraterrestrials. To any ET who comes down would look upon us as extra, whatever planet they are,
Right, right, right.
terrestrials, so to speak. So, but in my own research, and I can't underline this enough, I don't have cases where ETs come down and deliberately hurt people. It can be a very fearful experience for people, and they will immediately label it as negative or even downright evil, because they
Right,
feel
right.
like they're being taken against their will. Uh, Sometimes in the beginning, often this is how people will interpret it. And if you don't move beyond that and you just said, I'm not dealing with this, uh, this
Right.
will, be interpreted as a negative experience, when in fact, I don't think it is.
Okay.
Because when someone's taken on board, yes, it's scary. You're laid out, you're physically examined, and it's can cause absolute panic. And when someone's in a panic, they're not observing as well as someone who is calm and rational. And then they have missing time, and that's it. It's done, it's evil. But when someone moves past the fear, this is when you start to get the truth of contact. Because when someone's taken on board, often the whole purpose of being physically examined is really a checkup. It really is. Yes, they take genetic material, perhaps implanting and stuff like this, in terms of a fetus or being removed or implanted, or even implants in the body.
Right.
But I put a book out called The Healing Power of UFOs. 300 cases. It far outnumbers the so-called injury cases.
Okay.
And I
Interesting.
don't have cases where ETs deliberately hurt people or do sadistic behavior or torture. There are some out there in the literature. There are some people out there who are saying, this happened to me. I think some of this is misinformation, just lies, flat out, because our own governments are pushing forth a fear-based narrative.
Okay.
I think some is just very much fear-based interpretation of an encounter. I think some are what we would call MILABs, military abductions, not ETs, but our own, or elements within our own government, who are using drugs and hypnosis and psychotronics and really advanced technology to pull off a hoax and
Yeah,
say
yeah.
this is ET when it's not.
Right.
So it's a muddy waters out there. I just don't have those, I don't get many reptilian cases, I should say as well. I've gotten a few. Well, they don't really involve UFOs. I think the reptilians are real. And I know some people who had actually really benevolent encounters with them, and some no, not some. I think they're crypto-terrestrials. This is my assessment. I don't have really enough evidence to say for sure. Because, as much as I trust other researchers, I trust my own research more,
Right.
because I know I'm not a government agent. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
And there are good researchers out there who I absolutely trust, like Barbara Lamb and who else? Yvonne Smith, John Mack, I think is a good researcher. Timothy Good. There's a lot of good researchers out there. Linda Zimmerman, Michael Schratt. So I I absolutely think that reptilians are real. But the more I look into it, I think they might actually be from Earth and still living in underground cavern areas, perhaps. Some people do report them on ships. It's not as common as you might think. Uh, but yeah, so many different types of ETs
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
Grays, human looking, absolutely 100% human looking. Little short blue beings, short dwarf-like beings of all kinds, hairy or not. Very tall humanoids. Some tall whites, of course. Blue-skinned beings. I mean, there's so many different kinds. It's almost all humanoid. I find that interesting, almost
right.
without exception.
Yeah,
So it's a lot to unpack and try to categorize and figure out what's going on.
yeah,
But I honestly don't think they're here to take over or hurt us.
yeah,
I'm much, much more worried about the human elements here on Earth, the cabal, for
yeah,
lack of a better word.
yeah, yeah. No, I know. It's interesting. I'm very fascinated with Werner von Braun and his connection to alien beings and his, work with NASA. And recently I read an article by a woman I know, Mary Joyce, who just put out a article where Uri Geller, the magician, was shown an alien being that was, killed in a crash or experimented on by Dr. Werner von Braun. And I don't know where exactly it was where they had it. They had it in an underground place where he had to wear like an orange coat, like what they wore for NASA, to go into this cold area. And he photographed the being itself. And there were other stories about Werner von Braun having women from almost with a galactic background working at NASA, predicting what they needed to do in order to navigate the ships when they were going up. They would use their insight or their psychic abilities to help them. They said the women looked very similar, all of them. This was one of the workers who worked with Werner von Braun that reported this to Mary Joyce, and she passed it on
Interesting.
to me. So it was very
Well,
interesting. Yeah, I'm fascinated with one aspect of your book that you have, which you talk about extraterrestrial hitchhikers. Do you mean they were actually riding aboard, and what was their purpose in doing this?
yeah, this was an aspect of UFO encounters which caught my attention when I kept hearing cases of this. Because I love looking for those unusual patterns
Right,
in UFO encounters and sort of looking into cases that a lot of researchers might shy away from. And I kept hearing this. I think one of the first was from Brad Steiger, longtime pioneering researcher who had interviewed this lady, two ladies who were driving through the Arizona desert, and there's nothing out there, and they're on this highway during the day, and there's this beautiful man standing by the road,
right,
and they're not the type to just stop, but they did. For some reason, they felt compelled, and this man gets in their car, and he's what we would call Nordic. I don't really like that term. I call them human looking because
right.
they're not all Nordic ancestry. Some have dark skin, and but usually described as 6 foot, 6.5 feet, and broad-shouldered and muscular and genetically looking really handsome, or beautiful as it would be, which was true in his case. He did have blonde hair and blue eyes and so forth, and started talking in this kind of sing-song voice. They both felt like they knew him somehow, and things just started to get really eerie, uh, because they were both behaving in ways that they wouldn't normally behave in terms of picking someone up. And he said, you don't need to fear, everything's going to be fine. The next thing they knew, boom, they were going up in the car into a craft and ended up having a pretty extensive encounter. We're gone for, I think it was 3 days. Their parents were frantic because they were had supposed to check in at the end of that day. So that was one case.
Right, right.
And I kept finding others. There was a couple from a researcher I really like, Artie Six Killer Clark. Because there's a lot of researchers out there doing shoe fitting and cherry picking and trying to prove their theory. I like Artie's work because she just lays it out, facts only. And that's the kind of research I endeavor towards myself. And let the reader decide. Just give us the information and vet it as to your best of your ability. So that's what she's doing. And she had a case involving a gentleman, ironically enough, Arizona as well, traveling between Castle Rock and Chinle, I think it was. Gentleman's just driving along through the desert again, and there's a man standing by the side of the road, and he's thinking, oh, well, maybe it's another Native American because he's Native American and we help each other out. So he pulled over, picks this man up, and no, it's not a Native American. He's got very pale skin. He's wearing a jumpsuit, iridescent,
Wow.
typical alien fashion, and is driving along, and the man's kind of quiet. And they come upon a landed UFO. Next thing he knows, he's being pulled on board. So in case after case, it seems to be a sort of a method to sort of introduce a person to the ETs in a way that's not going to send them in straight panic
Right,
and
right.
get them on, but not always. I mean, there's another guy, a South American case, which was so interesting because this guy's driving to work and he sees this short, little, odd looking guy just standing by the side of the road. And again, for some weird reason, pulled over to pick him up. The guy gets in the seat. He's got like 4 fingers, bulging frog-like eyes, weird pale skin, a very strange odor. Clothes are just not normal. None of it is normal. Won't speak, just points ahead. I mean, everything about this guy was odd. And he tried to converse with them, would not converse, just made weird noises. I mean, this said the more he looked at him, the more he realized this guy was not human. He was
Yeah.
humanoid, but ended up giving him a ride until suddenly the guy starts making gestures like basically pull over here. And it was again out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's so many cases of this. I found well over a dozen. If it were one or two, I'd say, okay, fine.
Right,
But
right.
no, it's a lot. And I recently found another, again in South America, where a guy's driving along and this guy's a young blonde man, very well dressed, very smartly dressed, gives them a ride and they start conversing. The guy is super intelligent, asking all these questions of the driver, introduces his name. He says, my name is Alex. And the driver gave him his address at the beginning of the conversation. At the end of an hour-long ride, the guy repeats the address in detail and says, I'm going to see you again. And it was literally drops the guy off and continues his drive home. And 5 minutes later, he's taken on board a craft. And later taken on board, some months later. And there was this same hitchhiker, dressed exactly the same, by the way, in Earth clothes. So yeah, they're walking among us sometimes. And I think it's a method to get people on board
Yeah,
in a way.
yeah. Well, you're an inspiration doing the work you do, and the ability for myself to contact you and to speak to you about this work and others who share this information with credibility makes it a very interesting subject. To know that we're beyond what exists on this earth. What work are you doing now? Are you writing anything, or are you up to any different new projects?
Adam, I am.
Yeah,
I'm keeping really busy. This is such an important subject. I feel duty bound to do my work to inform the public.
right, right,
Yeah, I've just finished the Not From Here Volume 5 series of books. The hitchhiking is a chapter in an earlier volume. So I've
right.
been working on publicizing that. I'm going to put out Symmetry too. Symmetry is the book about Dolly Saffron, which covers her lifelong experiences. And I'm doing the interviews for the second book because we just touched the surface.
Right.
I want to put out another book on out of body experiences because when I started doing UFO research, I started having them myself, which I don't think is coincidence. Now, having done the research, these are related topics.
Yeah.
Contactees have this huge burst of psychic ability once they have contact. I've had my own contact for sure, and I think it's connected to this. And we have actually been to the Akashic Library, so I'm really interested to hear that you're aware of these, sort of things. So I'm
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that we experience. I think if a person is one of these lighthouses that has or will be the receptor of contact in some capacity throughout a lifetime, then I think people, if they don't find their path, they will be awoken to it through trauma, through out of body experiences, and through other types of ways of getting us to wake up, so to speak. Um,
Agree. Yeah.
yeah. So it's interesting for myself. I feel that way as well. As a child, I felt certain traumas were waking me up to out of body experiences, putting me on the path to being interested in this and seeing different things, and myself having dreams of a ship going by twice with two moons, uh, and other people telling me they saw the same thing, either in a dream or in a vision or something else. So, um, yeah, I think that's definitely the message. I think again, what you're doing is the work you're doing is great because you're giving a voice to information that needs to be put out there, and it's inspiring. Do you have a final message you want to leave the audience with about any of this, the work you do, or what you think is going to happen, or
Yeah. Yeah, I sure do. I would say one, don't look to our own governments for answers on this subject because they're lying about it from day one and still are. Don't buy into any fear-based narrative. There's no reason to fear this. It's quite the opposite. ETs are on basically a mission of healing, guiding, teaching, informing, waking us up to our own psychic ability
right?
and our own immortality, and the fact that we are related to them. They are us, we are them, we are one. So I would say if you want the answers about UFOs, look to the contactees. They they are the ones who've had direct experience. They know what it is,
Yeah.
not the so-called experts or pundits on TV. And yeah, just allow love and truth to guide your actions. Love is the answer. ETs have told many contactees this. And yeah, have fun and enjoy life on Earth. It's short. We're here to learn. So have fun with it.
Yeah, that's a great message. And if anybody was interested in reaching out to you, where could they do so? On
I'm pretty easy to find, actually. I'm on most forms of social media. Not all, they
yeah,
multiply constantly. But yeah, Facebook, of course, Twitter/X, Instagram. I have a website. Just punch my name. It'll take you there. It's prestondennett.weebly.com. A
okay.
YouTube channel. You can get my books on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, other online retailers. And yeah, always happy to hear from people, whether they've got a story to share or a question or a comment.
Yeah.
Like I said, an important topic. People need to wake up.
All right. On that note, I want to thank you for joining me and sharing again your time and your insight.